All right, so it's my pleasure today to introduce Michael Dowd. Michael is a best-selling eco-theologian, a TEDx speaker, a pro-future advocate. His work's been featured in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Newsweek, and much more. He's the author of Thank God for Evolution, How the Marriage of Science and Religion Will Transform Your Life and Our World. And Michael and his wife, Connie Barlow, who herself is a science writer, an evolutionary educator, and a climate activist, they together have addressed nearly 3,000 groups throughout North America over the past couple of decades. Their current project is called Post-Doom. You can find it at postdoom.com. It's about living meaningfully and compassionately and courageously in the face of climate disruption, ecological loss, and societal upset. And I think this message is even more important, even more relevant during this time of global pandemic. So you can find out more about their project at postdoom.com. Michael is a friend of mine and a mentor, and I am super excited to have him here. After this presentation, I hope you will, we're gonna have a short Q&A, and then I hope you'll join us for our virtual worship service where Michael will also be our guest speaker at 11 o'clock. So if you want to join us for that, you can just stay on the Zoom call, and we'll be moving into the worship service at 11. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, John. So I just want to honor John. Sometimes, you know, they say a prophet is without honor in his own home country or whatever. Many of us consider John truly one of the shining lights in this ecological, theological, climate grief world. So I just deeply honor you, brother. Okay, so can you all see that redwood tree?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So finding meaning in the dark, a post-doom big picture. This is where we are now in Eureka, California, surrounded by redwoods. And what I want to just cover this morning is a thing on language, that how we name reality. The language that we use to name primary reality determines our relationship to primary reality. And what I mean by primary reality is that which created us and that we depend on totally, so time and nature. The big picture, understanding our predicament, and basically what's possible and what's not possible, and what's inevitable given our situation. And then post-doom inspiration. I'm trying to figure out how to shrink my, hold on just a second here. Okay, there we go. And then really, I'll spend more time on this during the little homily or sermon, but remember who you are and what matters most is so vital for staying sane, sober, and inspired in these contracting, difficult times. Two of my great mentors, William Catton and Thomas Berry. William Catton is the author of Overshoot, the single most important book I've ever read in my life. And these two quotes really capture our predicament pretty powerfully. Human society is inherently part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry, the author of The Dream of the Earth and The Great Work and a number of others, said the most difficult transition to make is from a human-centered to a life-centered norm of progress. If there's to be any true progress, the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. Joseph Brodsky won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1987, and he was a Soviet a professor, taught at some of the most prestigious colleges. And he famously said, "You Americans are so naive. You think evil is going to come into your houses wearing big black boots. It doesn't happen like that. Look at the language. It begins in the language." So our language for this, our language for our creator, sustainer, and end matters. Gaia is a different, we have a different relationship if we genuinely relate to primary reality as primary, or if we just think of it as the environment. This is what we now know, of course, is that we live in a nested reality, subsystems within larger systems and so forth. And we're in the middle. We're made up of smaller creative intelligent realities that we totally depend upon, and we are dependent upon larger creative intelligent realities. And so that's what I mean by primary realities, everything inside us and outside us that we wouldn't exist if that wasn't real. And we need to live in right relationship to that. Martin Buber, the Jewish theologian, famously said that you basically, you can't survive. Our species will not survive if we have an I-it relationship to what I'm calling primary reality. We need an I-thou relationship, as all indigenous cultures knew. It's the opposite of a mechanistic worldview, this idea that nature is a complex clock and God is a supernatural clockmaker, that if you believe in that being, you're a theist, and if you disbelieve in that being, you're an atheist, and both sides tend to treat the biosphere as an it that we think we can exploit. It's crazy. So primary reality must be honored as primary. And one of the things that I would say is just factually the case is that every sustainable culture, every pro-future culture, every culture that lived in a mutually enhancing relationship with primary reality had an eco-theo worldview. That is, their eco was divine, and their understanding of the spirit world or the divine, however that was mythologized, a zillion different ways, was alive, that was present in the living world. So I've started spelling God, G-O-D, capital G, capital O, capital D, and I imagine the planet Earth as the O. It's just a mental tool, but that when I use the word God, I'm meaning reality with a personality. There's a number of Catholic nuns and ecofeminists that have started spelling God the Old English way. This is actually the Old English spelling, G-O-D-D-E, and they do that because it's A, gender neutral, but also, again, what we're meaning is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in reality or not, but just like every other species, we either live in right relationship to reality or we go extinct. It's just that simple. Now, when I speak to college students, I can usually count on some philosophy major to challenge me and say, well, what do you mean by reality? And I love this quote from Philip K. Dick. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And that includes time and nature. Whatever else may be real at that level, time is real and nature is real. And that's why we understand that pro-future culture is related that way. I mean, what do you call that which brought everything into being, that which nourishes and sustains everything, and that which receives everything at its end? Doesn't matter whether you believe in this or not, but what do we call it? Well, what we call reality, what we call nature, what we call the universe, indigenous cultures experience personally and honored in an I-thou way as primary reality, creator, great spirit, Gaia, whatever. I think it's our fundamental inability to understand personification that is giving human characteristics to what's more than human that has led to the problems that we're now in, certainly one of them. Wendell Berry understood the power of personification. Nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. James Hillman, one of the leading psychologists of the last 60 years, said, loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify, and to personify carries us into myth. It basically said you can't understand the world's myths and religions if you don't understand our ability, our innate instinct to give human characteristics to what's more than human. And of course, recently, just in the last 5 years, Conservation International and Hollywood teamed up, and there's about, I don't know, 16, 18 of these 1 or 2 minute videos where some Hollywood star personifies some aspect of nature. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen Julia Roberts speaking not about nature, she's nature speaking. I highly encourage these, naturespeaking.org. For example, every culture has personified the climate. They've interpreted climate as either blessing or judgment, which is not a surprise because can you think of any force in the universe that more consistently brings cultures into being, sustains them, and destroys them than climate? So, for example, in the Hindu tradition, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, if you think of them as separate beings, supernatural beings, you trivialize that. It's a personification of the creative force of the universe, the sustaining force of the universe, and of the destructive force of the universe. The environment is not our surroundings, it's our source, sustenance, and end. But by calling God, by calling Gaia the environment, we deceive ourselves and think that we can abuse it, use it. So the two primary ways of relating to primary reality are sustainable and unsustainable. Sustainable is the first 97 to 99% of human history, depending upon how you define humans, beginning at Homo sapiens or Homo habilis. And really, this is to speak mythically, in the garden. It was all about stability. It was living in a faithful relationship to the ancestors, a faithful relationships to the descendants, and a faithful relationship to the creator, Earth, the bioregion. The last 1 to 3% of human history, just the last 8,000 years or so, we've lived more or less unsustainably. That's why we see over 100 boom and bust. You know, we call them the rise and fall of civilizations, but it's booms and busts, booms and busts, booms and busts, where progress is undeniable and then regress is undeniable. So sustainable means accountable or faithful. Unsustainable means unaccountable or unfaithful. And again, I'm using faithful. These are words that we're not used to thinking, but that's what it is. It's to be faithful to the past and to the future, and being faithful to the larger body of life upon which we depend entirely. So faithful cultures, stability, humility, that sense of an I-thou relationship to your creator, sustainer, and end. It's life-centered, ecotheocentric, and it's all about honoring sacred limits. That was the fundamental role of religion, lifeways really, in sustainable cultures. In fact, Teddy Goldsmith defines religion as that force which insists on limits being honored. And that's not been what's happening now. Unfaithful cultures, exploitive, all about hubris. It's like the difference between thinking that the world belongs to us or we belong to the world. That's the humility, or the hubris, the world belongs to us. Humility is we belong to the world. Human-centered, and it's all about limitlessness, this self-indulgence. One of the books that's been significant for me is Teddy Goldsmith, The Way, an Ecological Worldview. And he defines religion as the control mechanism of sustainable cultures. That is, that aspect of society that insists that the future is not compromised by the present. Now, today, most religions are asleep at the wheel. They're not performing that function. So in unsustainable cultures, religion gets downgraded to being merely a coping mechanism, because we're living in unsustainable cultures, and there's no way that right now that religions can hold the political world to account, but we may be able to again. It's not going to stop this, but it could be redemptive for our species and the body of life. So in traditional, stable, sustainable, pro-future societies, technology, settlements, the economy, education, community, basically everything is in accord with the needs of the biosphere. And of course, they didn't refer to primary reality as the biosphere. They had some mythic name for the biosphere, but everything needs to be in accord with the needs of the biosphere, which of course makes sense if you remember the nested nature of reality. So religion needs science, and evidence needs a moral voice, which can't happen when the biosphere is exploited as it rather than honored as thou. We think of civilization as a good thing, and we're unaware, most of us, that there have been over 100. This is last year in the BBC, Luke Kemp wrote a thing called "Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse?" And he has a chart that shows 88 civilizations between 3000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. So that's just this 4,000 year period. And he takes a look. The reason that's actually over 100 is if you go back before 3000 BCE, and if you look at the last 1,000 years, it's about 120. And he takes a look at the main reasons why civilizations have collapsed. The average lifespan was 336 years. And overshoot, that is using more resources and exuding more waste, is the fundamental way. And then there's other things, complexity, technology, using technology to try to solve problems created by technology is also one of the things that brings cultures down. Inequality, the growing gap between the rich and the poor is a dead, it's a total sign that a society or culture is in decline or going to be collapsing soon. And then of course, external shocks, and then just randomness. Religious failure are the first three. That is the failure of the moral voice of society to hold the political economic leaders to account that the future is not compromised by the present. These are painful quotes. I just want to warn you. Forests precede civilizations and deserts follow them. All our exalted technological progress, civilization for that matter, is comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. The end of the human race will be that it will eventually die of civilization. And then the earth is littered with the ruins of empires and civilizations that once believed that they were eternal. Why technology won't solve our problems is that technology and the market got us into this mess. So this book, Technofix, why human technology that doesn't integrate with life's technology does more harm than good. It just does it over time. Technology in the context of ongoing economic growth does not promote sustainability, but hastens collapse. Most technological solutions to social and technology-created problems are counterproductive. And this book also shows why new technologies tend to be uncritically accepted and who really controls the direction of change and why civilization undermines many core human needs. That's one of the reasons why Michael Moore's documentary, Planet of the Humans, is getting such criticism from the liberals and progressives and the activists, because I certainly did when, my faith was in technology to save our butts, green technology. Another potent quote: civilization is by its very nature a long-running Ponzi scheme. It lives by robbing nature and borrowing from the future, exploiting its hinterland until there's nothing left to exploit, after which it implodes. While it still lives, it generates a temporary and fictitious surplus that it uses to enrich and empower the few and to dispossess and dominate the many. Industrial civilization is the apotheosis and quintessence of this fatal course. A fortunate minority gains luxuries and freedoms galore, but only by slaughtering, poisoning, and exhausting creation. And this is what all city-based, human-centered, anthropocentric civilizations have done. William Olfels is probably the leading person in the English-speaking world that brings the ecological paradigm to politics and governance. How do we mimic the wisdom of nature and how we organize ourselves? Our fundamental problem is that we no longer listen to what the earth, its landscape and climate, its mountains and valleys, and all the flora and fauna of the planet are telling us. And I say that's because of how we think and name, the language that we've used by thinking just of the environment. One of Thomas Berry's other famous quotes, he says that there's no way our species can continue into the future in any kind of sustainable way unless we realize that the universe is not a collection of objects, it's a communion of subjects. So language, naming, and determines how we relate to reality. The big picture, understanding our predicament and what's inevitable. I love this quote from Ed Wilson: the evolutionary epic is probably the best myth that we will ever have. There is science now to construct the story of the journey that we've made on this earth, the story that connects us with all beings. Right now, we need to remember that story, to harvest it and taste it, for we are in a hard time, and it is the knowledge of the bigger story that's going to carry us through. Joanna Macy is probably my most significant female mentor. So I realize I'm going rather rapidly, but I just created this program yesterday, so I'm not confident that it's only 45 minutes long, so that's why I'm kind of zipping. So at a cosmic century, if you compress the whole history of the universe into 100 years, this is the time scale. Every hour is 17,000 years, roughly. I'm obviously rounding things off. Every day is 400,000 years. So at this time scale, we see this progression of life. Our solar system only comes into being at 67. Earth cools below the boiling point of water, oceans at 69. Earth comes alive, Gaia comes alive at 71, and then these start eating the photons of the sun, photosynthesis. And then you've got this long period of biological evolution. But I just want to take a look just very briefly at the last 4 years, the last 550 million years. Now this is a logarithmic time chart, so it's easy to misread this. Degrees Celsius is on the left, degrees Fahrenheit on the right, but this is just the temperature of Earth over the last 550 million years. So these are the 17 glacial periods, the Milankovitch cycles. The Earth wobbles like a top, which is one of the main drivers of glaciers. And we know of 17 of those. Here's the projections in 25 to 30 years, and then in 60 to 80 years. These are the projections of temperature. Now, how can we be confident in those? Well, let's look at what reality, whether you use mythic language, God or Gaia or the universe, whatever, or just secular language, but what's been revealed about CO2 levels over the last 800,000 years? Well, here we see 8 ice ages. The ice ages are all the low point where the white goes low. We're now at 415. It's actually, I think we're at 418. I checked yesterday, 418 parts per million. So the ice age average was 200 parts per million. The pre-industrial average was 280 parts per million. And why 350.org is trying to get us down to 350 is that we began the age of mass extinctions, where we're extinguishing species at a very rapid rate in the last 50 years. And that's why the idea that humans can survive in a world of 450 or 500 parts per million is crazy. And we know that CO2 concentration, global temperature, and sea level all march and all rise and fall in lockstep. Sometimes one of them leads, sometimes another one leads, but they all rise and fall in lockstep. So if we're up here at 418, it's not going to be long before temperature and sea level considerably rises. So back here to this chart, the reason we can have confidence in these numbers is that the last time CO2 levels were between 400 and 500 parts per million, sea level was 50 to 150 feet higher than now. That's an average of 3 to 10 miles further inland, depending upon where you live. And then temperature was 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. That's 4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit higher than now. So stability is this period here. This is the agriculture. This is what we need for civilizations, and what's required for agriculture. And we're likely to go extinct at anything more than 3 degrees Celsius. The idea that people are talking about we could live in a world of 4 degrees Celsius, our bodies can't survive that. So back here to this chart. The entirety of human history is the last week on a cosmic century timeline. If the beginning of the universe was 1 second after midnight of January 1st of the year 0, and right now is December 31st of the 99th year at midnight, just about to go into the 100th year, at that time scale, humans have been around for the last week. In fact, not only is it that we've only been around for a week, civilization is just in the last 40 minutes. So the first 98% of human history were lifeways, an eco-theo worldview. We call it animism, but it wasn't a belief-based. It was relating personally to the living world in all of its manifestations, foraging and hunting, families and clans. Everything we associate with civilization and cities and empires and agriculture, all that is just in the last 40 minutes. And then if we survive, which we may not, but if we survive this bottleneck, it'll be a return to ecotheo, a return to Gaia, return to relating to the biosphere as a greater thou, not a lesser it. That's why I speak of it as the prodigal species. So just to quickly look at just the last hour, the last 17,000 years on a cosmic century timeline, there are sustainable forms of agriculture, permaculture, horticulture, but we start seeing totalitarian, what Daniel Quinn called totalitarian agriculture, where it's all human-centered. We no longer care about other species and honor other species. It's now all about us. That's why I call it idolatry. And then chieftains and kingdoms at 11:30 p.m., city-states in writing at 11:40 p.m., 5,000 years ago, empires, the axial age, the era of thinking that religion is about beliefs rather than relationship. It's all about the individual escaping the world. It's very otherworldly oriented these last 2,500 years, most of the religious traditions. And as I said, we know of over 100 boom and bust civilizations between this 1135 and now. We've only had a clockwork universe, an understanding of nature as a complex clock for the last 2 minutes, because we didn't have that worldview until we invented pendulum clocks. And that trivializes God. Now God is not a synonym or synonymous with reality. Now God is a being outside the universe. And then industrial overshoot, the 6th great mass extinction, and a carbon pulse just in the last minute. And what I mean by carbon pulse is that if you go back 8,000 years and you go forward 8,000 years, assuming we survive, the only forms of energy that are going to sustain us and that have in the past are human and animal muscle power and firewood. So that's why I call this the last 35 to 40 minutes, the age of human-centeredness, the age of idolatry, to use religious language. William Catton always spoke about the difference between problems that can be potentially solved and predicaments which have to be adapted to. And climate change is not a problem. It's a predicament. It's like death is not a problem. It's a predicament. All these different things: climate chaos, global weirding, topsoil desecration and loss, ocean acidification, the sixth great mass extinction, critical resource depletion, chemical and nuclear wastes, the growing gulf between the rich and the poor, economic instability and insanity, political dysfunction, the shrinking of in-groups, the rise of totalitarianism and other isms. We focus on these, and well, we should, but all of these are symptoms, and that's why green energy and green technology is not going to solve all these. They're all symptoms of ecological overshoot. That is, we've used too many resources and exuded too much waste, and so the systems are breaking down. And what causes that is human-centeredness. And that can take a secular version or religious. If you have a trivial, limited, finite, unreal, and otherworldly notion of God, a God outside the universe, then you're going to commit overshoot. You're going to go into overshoot. But also secular, if the market or technology or progress is your God, that is your primary commitment, your ultimate reality, then you're also going to commit overshoot. So back here to this chart. What can we confidently say that reality is telling us through evidence is now inevitable or highly likely in the next 250 years? That is the next minute on the cosmic century timeline. Well, before we even do that, I want to say one thing about the next year, because this is the big picture. And there will be another 140 million years. Humans won't exist. No mammal our size lasts more than 3 or 4 million years. So we're going to go extinct, whether that's in the next 10 or 20 years or the next 2 million years. It's going to be probably in that range. And here's the time scale again. So each month is 12 million years. And one of the things that genuinely gives me hope is that the worst case scenario, let's say there's this pandemic, it just so bad and the economy collapses and World War III happens and, we go extinct, 90% of other species go extinct, and all of our nuclear power plants melt down. Worst case scenario. By early February, Earth will have recovered. That's 12 to 15 million years from now. And that gives me hope, because we're not going to see worst case scenario. We're just not. So back here to the next 250 years. Again, this is what's considered inevitable or highly likely in the best case and medium case Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenarios. There will be climate chaos. There'll be bigger storms, bigger droughts, growing deserts, more intense wildfires, and shifts in where we can grow food and where we can live. This is inevitable. Sea level will continue to rise 25 to 40 feet, and that's even if all humans went extinct tonight. Like if some virus wiped us out tonight and every human died tonight, the seas would continue to rise 25 to 40 feet. And the scientists that deal with the oceans, there's nobody that would debate that. We are already in the sixth great extinction, and we may be on the list. The end of the fossil fuel era. A toxic legacy, chemical and nuclear wastes. There will be a contamination of many ocean shorelines, because when the seas rise 25 to 40 feet, it's going to inundate the world's oceans. And it doesn't happen gradually. It usually happens in pulses. And some of these communities are not going to be able to afford to move all their toxic stuff away from the oceans, like Houston, for example. So there's going to be a contamination of many ocean shorelines. Population will shrink to 500 million or less, if we survive at all, due to drought, famine, war, and living in a post-antibiotic age. And I can say that confidently because for all of human history, before mining these fossil fuels, population was never more than about 500 million people. So that's the carrying capacity of the Earth for humans. The end of the American Empire and the long descent of industrial civilization. Again, things could wig out in the Arctic real seriously, in which case it won't be a long descent, it's a fairly rapid collapse. But almost all civilizations, unless they are extinguished because of a volcano or something, it's a stair step. Rome, we talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire. It took 320 years. It was a stair step, and there were partial recoveries. That's typically the way things collapse. The death of techno-idolatry. The secular techno-narcissistic delusion of everlasting growth on a finite planet. Salvage and ecotechnic societies. Whatever people survive the next 50 years will be living for hundreds of years in being able to salvage materials in the current cities and all. And everything will become local. Agroecology, permaculture, global. Millions may live meaningful lives. Typically in collapse, you do see about 20% of the worst of humanity shows up, but you see 80% of the best of humanity, as most of us are experiencing in terms of people being compassionate and generous and kind and considerate with each other. That's the norm. And there is also evil. And of course, it matters where you live. Now, why I emphasize millions may live meaningful lives is the one thing on this chart that I'm at pains to bring up is that this is best case and medium case intergovernmental panel on climate change scenarios. Unfortunately, we're tracking close to worst case on many measures. And the majority of people will deny most of the above right up until the very end, so we can have compassion for ourselves and others. Denial, of course, is not just a river in Egypt. Denial is the largely unconscious habit of thought whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview or legacy, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of superiority. It's also the instinctual impulse to reject or discount information that calls into question our hopes, assumptions, or expectations about the future. And everybody is prone to denial. I'm not free of it. You're not free of it. Nobody's free of it. I've heard of denial. I just don't believe in it. Burying my head in the sand over climate change is much easier now that half the world has turned to desert. It's not denial. I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. And who of us can't relate to this? My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. So denial can be healthy. In fact, Stephen Jenkinson, I love this quote. He says, inattention, that is not paying attention to the world's ecological state, is well advised, because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, contentment, and your sense of well-being. Having a conscience now is a grief-soaked proposition. If you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. And his little documentary, hour and 10-minute documentary, Grief Walker, is a must-watch. And his book, Die Wise, is the wisest thing I've ever read on mortality and death. I think I'm actually going to cover these questions. I'm not going to say anything about them now, because I'll do this in the homily. But these 4 questions reveal the insanity. The fact that we even take these questions real. Is God real? Does God exist? To ask that question, you have to already start with a trivial notion of God. No one would ever say, does the biosphere exist? Is the biosphere real? Will civilization collapse? Well, that sounds like it's in the future. Civilization has been collapsing for 30 years. That's the Rust Belt in the United States, is the collapse of industrialism in the United States. It's already collapsing, and every civilization collapses. Will we go extinct? Well, of course we're going to go extinct. It may be 2 million years from now. It may be in the next 50 years, but of course we'll go extinct. And then is it too late? Is there any hope? No, it's not too late. And yes, it is too late, depending upon what you're talking about. It's too late to save industrialism from hitting the wall, the consequences of its own actions. It's too late for many things, but it's not too late for virtually everything that matters. Everything that gives our lives meaning and joy and fulfillment. It's not too late for any of that. So yes, there's hope, but it's not hope, depending upon what you're hoping for or hoping in. Grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the 4-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful and hopeless. They're 2 sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. The depth of your grief is the measure of your love. So we look quickly at naming. How we name primary reality determines our relationship to time and nature. The big picture, kind of zip through the big picture, understanding our predicament and what's inevitable. And I want to conclude this session on post-doom inspiration. What I mean by post-doom is these are a series of conversations that I've been having. Oh, and I actually want to say something also about anger, because I used to think that I was supposed to transcend anger, and anger can be a tremendous, in fact, some dear friends that are on this call inspired me in a conversation just last week to really channel that anger, to allow that anger to be a motivating force, not to blame, but to drive me to action. Anger is such a gift if you honor it and channel it. So it's not just about grief. But post-doom are conversations that help us get to the place of compassion and generosity and healthy channeled anger and being a blessing to the larger body of life and being engaged in activism, even when we know it won't save the world. It's nonetheless a moral obligation, the mother of all moral obligations. So regenerative conversations exploring overshoot, grief, grounding, and gratitude. Here are my definitions of doom. This is sort of collective intelligence. I've been working on these for some months. Doom, definition, a common feeling of ugh or dread upon realizing that technological progress and economic growth and development are the root of our predicament, not our way out. When you get that, it's a really ugh in your gut. A name for the anxiety and fear called forth when living in a coronavirus era that triggers an economic depression. And then the midpoint between denial and regeneration. See, a lot of people don't allow themselves to feel doom because they think that they're going to stay in despair the entire time. And no, there's a post-doom place that you can get to. Inspired, fearless activism, inspired local action. It's not about in order to, it's about doing it because you are profoundly in love with life, in love with the future, and going to make as big a difference as you can. So the midpoint between denial and regeneration. When I speak in Christian churches, I say denial, the midpoint between denial and resurrection. But I'm talking about compost theology, that earth is about regenerating. That's what life does. And we'll do that even if we go extinct in the near term. Post-doom is what opens up when we accept the inevitable, honor our grief, channel our anger, and prioritize what is pro-future and soul-nourishing. It's a fearless reverence for life and relative equanimity, even in the midst of abrupt climate change, a global pandemic, and collapse of both the health of the biosphere and business as usual. And it's living meaningfully, compassionately, and courageously, no matter what. So I've been having these amazing conversations. I've had about 50 of them already, and we've edited about 30. And these are like the who's who. These are some of the most inspired people that have moved through the grief and the despair and all that, and then are now channeling their anger where that's there, living out of compassionate, generous action. There's so many different ways to do this. There's not one spiritual path or one philosophical approach. There's so many ways to do that. And I highly encourage, they're all free up online, just postdoom.com. Obviously, you see John Halstead there on the left-hand side. So I want to conclude this time with remember who you are and remember what matters most. And then I'll go more into the spiritual aspects of that in the sermon or homily. But remember who you are. The first thing, this is my great story beads. I have a 15-foot string of beads where each bead signifies some significant moment in the history of the universe. The cosmic rosary. So the first thing to realize is that we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. We're not separate from nature. And we've done these kids all over the world have created these great story beads where each bead that means something to them, we give them the timeline and then they just pick whichever one's for them and the most significant events in their life story, because their story is part of the great story. So I often do children's, back when I was doing in-person programs, kids programs, I've got one called You Are Larger, Older, and Have a Much Bigger and Weirder Family Than You Know. Because of course, we're related to the entire body of life. Connie did a program with her beads one time, and afterwards, this little, I think she's an 8 or 9-year-old girl, went running out in the parking lot, Mommy, Mommy, I'm related to a duck-billed platypus. You know? So this sense of relatedness to everything. That's what the grief, if you allow yourself to feel grief, it not only is a measure of your love, but it's also profoundly a reminder of your interconnectedness to the body of life of which you're a part. One of my favorite quotes from Marlon Lavenar, the pastor of All Souls Church, the largest Unitarian church in the country, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He says, you know, we've all heard some fundamentalist-minded person say, don't tell me I'm related to monkeys. But now that we understand DNA and have cracked its code, we know that we're not just related to monkeys, we're related to zucchini. So let's get over it. So here's at a big story. John, you'll recognize John Host. He's got the most extensive set of great story beads of anybody I know. Percy Shelley in 1812 captures this sense of identity, the expanded sense of identity. Remember who you are. He says, I am the eye with which the universe beholds itself and knows it is divine. So a God's eye view of the world, a reality's eye view of the world is this. It's the view from within every set of eyes. The subjective experience of through every creature has got to be included in whatever we mean by a God's eye view of the world. Earth is our larger body. It's our larger self. Building topsoil and planting trees while nurturing community is perhaps the most holy work that we can be engaged in. I love this quote from Paul Hawken. There's a rabbinical teaching that says, if you're told the world is ending and the Messiah has arrived, first plant a tree, then see if the story is true. I got to see what time it is. Oh, I got a couple minutes. Look at that. Okay, good. This will only take a couple minutes. So these 5 L's are sort of practical. How can we stay sane, sober, and inspired in contracting times? Well, love something. You can do this even in quarantine, love life in whatever ways it's showing up for you. Plant a garden if you can, tend to trees, find some seeds of any plants that you love that are further south, warm adapted, and then plant them further north. The difference between hundreds of species of plants and trees, native trees, going extinct this century, or those same 100 species or a lot more, maybe thousands of species of plants and shrubs and trees surviving this century, will be whether humans assist them in migrating to cooler climes faster than they can move. Plants don't have legs, so it's called assisted migration. It's legal. And my wife is one of the leading point people in North America on this field of assisted migration. We can all do that. We can all love life. Learn something. Learn new skills. I mean, how many people have been learning how to, do some of the basic things, because that's what you do in depressions. That's what you do in contraction, is you get back to basics. Let go of something. We can all get used to less, L-E-S-S, less energy, less stuff, less stimulation. Laugh at something. It's so important to keep a sense of humor. It really is vital, but especially dark humor, gallows humor. It's necessary. And then legacy, pass something forward. And again, this is true even if we go extinct in the next 50 years. There are things that you can do. Building topsoil, for example, is a blessing even if we go extinct. Planting trees, anything that you can do to be a blessing to others and to be a contribution in terms of passing on to someone younger than you what you know, skills you have, knowledge that you have. So love something, learn something, let go of something, laugh at something, and pass something forward. Legacy. You don't need to do everything. Do what calls your heart. Effective action comes from love. It is unstoppable, and it is enough. The sorrow, grief, and rage you feel is a measure of your humanity and your evolutionary maturity. As your heart breaks open, there will be room for the world to heal. Do not lose heart. We were made for these times. Action on behalf of life transforms, because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal. It's not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. That's the great reckoning. We're in the great reckoning. It's a predicament. It's just a fact. But it can also, I believe, be the great homecoming. Humanity, the prodigal species. Yes, we squandered our inheritance. Yes, we're waking up to our predicament, and hopefully coming home to reality. And that can happen again, even if we go extinct. So my course, I've got a course for going more deeply into all this stuff, 8 20-minute sessions. Part 1 is coming home to reality. Part 2, practical wisdom. And then here's all my contact information. So let me back up. So I'll just leave that there for a minute. My phone number and email address, feel free to contact me, michaelbdowd@gmail.com. I'm happy to answer questions or whatever. And then YouTube, The Great Story and Reverend Reality. That's why I'm wearing a green clergy shirt. I'm committed to religion coming home to reality. And then SoundCloud, grace limits, and then, or if you just Google Michael Dowd on SoundCloud, got tons of stuff that's all freely available. So John, and I apologize for how rapidly I went through that. My friends that are on this call, I did a much longer version of this for First Unitarian of Dallas, or no, actually, yeah, First Unitarian Dallas. And my friend Michael Milkey said it was not like trying to drink out of a fire hose. It was that the fire hose put out the fire, but it knocked the house down. So I do apologize.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And it was a lot of information, but also a lot of emotion to process in a short period of time. So if anybody has any questions, there's two ways you can ask your question. One is to go to the chat box. So if you're on your computer and you click on chat at the bottom of your screen, a chat box should open up and you can type a question in there that either Michael or I can read. Or if you want, there's a raise hand function. And to get to that, you need to click on participants at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a list of people pop up. And at the bottom of that box, there should be an option to raise hand. And then I will see your hand and unmute you. And if worst comes to worst, you just want to wave your hand frantically into the camera, I will hopefully see you, and because I have to go through 4 different screens here to see everybody. But if you wave your hand furiously, I will look for you and unmute you so you can ask your question of Michael. Joe, I see you waving your hand frantically, so I'm going to mute you 1 second.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
This is more a statement than a question. That was wonderful. It kind of verbalized everything that I've felt basically even as a conscious adolescent, and it kind of put into words, you know, all my feelings as I just pick a bag full of green onions and didn't find any mushrooms, but the knowledge, I've been a fatalist my whole life, but becoming okay with that, it took me 50 years. And that was a wonderful way to verbalize it all. Thank you. You can mute me now.
Why is it still on me, John? I don't know why. It should be on the whoever asked the question, or so I'm not sure why it's staying on me. And we can't hear you. You're muted.
Thank you. I fixed that. And Michael, you're unmuted. So.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Someone asked if the presentation is being recorded, and yes, it is, and it will be shared on Facebook, on YouTube, and on the church website. Okay.
Wow, I just noticed that John Cleland Host is on the call as well.
Hi, John.
He's the one that had the beads.
I have a question for you, Michael.
Okay.
So when we're talking about the difference between a doom mentality, which is the natural reaction to hearing and realizing our predicament, and then the post-doom mentality, what maybe you can speak from your own experience, but what helps that transition from because I think people resist the acknowledgement of our reality because of the fear of that sense of doom and dread and anxiety, and not seeing the possibility of there being something beyond that. So what helps that transition, or what has helped that transition for you?
Yeah, thanks. The three things that have made the biggest difference by far is, one, remembering that I'm not separate from the universe, that I'm part of life, I'm an expression of life, and that in the same way that the cells in my body all live and die, and yet my body continues, that life in its different manifestations lives and dies, and yet my larger self, my larger body, earth continues, life continues. So my faith is in time. My faith is in evolution. My faith is in ecology. And my sense of self doesn't stop with my skin. So one is that sense of identity, because that can make a huge difference. The other is to not fear grief. Unless you feel some grief, you're probably going to be afraid. Now, there are some people that that's not the case, but most of us need to feel anxiety, feel grief, feel despair, we've got to cry, and then allow that, the tears and the anger and the whatever, our love for life, our love for the future, to motivate us. And that's where the anger can be useful when it's channeled. So the biggest thing is the identity, recognizing that I'm mortal. Connie and I play a game that, well, let me back up. We also personify things. Personification isn't just a cute trick. Personification is life-changing. For example, there's Connie, there's Michael, and then there's Jasmine. And Jasmine is the mythic personification of us, or we. And sometimes it's really clear what Connie wants to do and what Michael wants to do. But when we ask, what does Jasmine want? It allows me as a man to not be attached to my position, and I can go with something she might have suggested in the first place, but I don't feel like she's won and I've lost. I feel proud that I'm doing what's good for Jasmine. Gaia is a personification of life. Nora is our personification of North America. Great soul. When I get off this call, Connie and I are going to go outside, because every morning we sing, "Hi, hi, great soul, we love you so." And then at night we sing, "Bye, bye, great soul." These are personifications. And that, having a personal relationship to life in its various manifestations, is one of the things that allows me to look beyond doom to post-doom. It's one of those things that gives me a way of being grateful. In the same way that I was 10 years ago, I had a very serious bout of cancer. I had a tumor the size of my fist in my spleen. And there was a period before the chemo started working, there was a period where we thought I could die in the next 8 months. And so ever since then, I've not taken my life for granted. Fortunately, the chemo did work, but I still treat each season as if it could be our last. So one of Connie's and my rituals is at the end of every season, we personify, we speak, like we'll be outside looking at the sunset or whatever, and one of us will say, "Thank you, spring, for being such a blessing. If one or both of us don't experience you again," and we actually hold in our minds the possibility that one or both of us are going to die before the springtime comes around next time. If one or both of us don't experience you again, we just cherish what a gift you are, what a gift you've been. And then we hold that. So that sense of mortality, something about embracing mortality really allows you to move beyond doom to fearless, compassionate, generous activism and deep trust. I consider faith in God just a mythic way of saying trust in reality, trust in life, trust in the way things are. So
Thank you, Craig.
And then the last thing, is being in action in some way to be a blessing to others. I'll say a lot more about that in my homily.
Thank you. Greg, I'm going to get you before the end here, so I'm going to mute you 1 second. There you go. You should be unmuted.
I was curious when you were talking about going to this church in Dallas, and one of the things that has really struck me is the failure of religion to relate to young people. And they've been realistic, I guess, in walking away from it because nothing has been meaningful. And to me, there's a wonderful opportunity here to connect with young people who often feel as if there's nothing to live for, and to embrace that idea that this is what it is, but this is what we can do. So I'm rather curious if you have had any experience with any of your congregations that you've spoken to about how to connect with young people and develop a hopeful community that have some place to go and to talk.
Yeah, it is definitely challenging. I mean, I speak, as John mentioned in his introduction, I've spoken to like 2,900 groups across the philosophical and religious spectrum, and including many young groups, youth groups and young people. But you're right. I mean, in the Christian tradition, most young people in the Christian tradition, again, not fundamentalists, but moderate to liberal Christians, see it as irrelevant because of what I call idolatry of the written word, idolatry of the otherworldly, and idolatry of beliefs. Those are the three main forms of religious human-centeredness, religious idolatry, religious anthropocentrism, idolatry of the written word, thinking that our best map of reality is some ancient text, idolatry of the otherworldly, where we think ultimate value, ultimate reality exists is only outside time and nature, and idolatry of beliefs, where we privilege beliefs over evidence, over knowledge. So young people just find the church largely irrelevant for Christians. But it's the same in Unitarian. Kids are growing up in a time, it's such a scary time, and many of them are going to blame baby boomers, my generation. Understandably, they're not going to have a longer perspective and realize that, oh, we're heirs to 6,000-7,000 years of human-centeredness. It's like, of course, we're in this predicament. It's not just the fault of the baby boomers or the fossil fuel industry or whatever else the brunt of the anger is. But you're absolutely right. I think it's a moral imperative to stand with young people, even if they have some, what we would discern or judge as unrealistic visions of the future, like 100% renewables in the next 5 years or whatever. Nonetheless, it's a moral obligation to stand with young people in their fight for, quest for, hunger for intergenerational justice.
Thank you, Michael. There's a question in the chat box from Carl. I'm going to read it. My understanding of Michael's presentation is that civilization itself has created this predicament. Whereas my outlook is that the drive to profit and the, quote, whatever it takes approach to achieve that profit, at least in this era, the driving force behind our predicament, not civilization itself. Is there a difference in these outlooks, or does Michael's approach take my outlook into account?
Yeah, in the same way as those nesting dolls, I 100% agree with you. It's our economic system and our political system, but especially the economic system. I mean, there has never been in the history of humanity a market-based economic system that didn't commit ecocide, that didn't self-destruct, because market systems treat primary reality not as primary. They treat it as a place, a bunch of resources and a place for our waste. And that's unsustainable. That's unfaithful to use religious language or mythic language. And so, yes, I completely agree with you, but it's still city-based civilizations where you find market economies emerging.
Thank you. Joe, you asked about where this will be made available, and yes, we will make links available for all of Michael's information. He has been very prolific in his videos and writing, so you can, we'll make all that available for you. Vince has a question. Isn't the, quote, written word the living continuation of those who lived before us? Vince, if you want, I'm going to unmute you so you can explain that a little bit.
Yes, I was just surprised a little bit by what Michael said, because these great cultural traditions of the past, and I'm acknowledging them from so many other, not just one faith tradition, but many faith traditions. And don't they provide us with guidance in contacting our inner being, our spiritual being?
No question, absolutely. And there's a way of honoring. I'm not against written text. I mean, my library, I've read the Bible straight through twice. There's lots of great stuff in there. Connie's read the Quran and the Book of Mormon. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in just in the world's literature. The challenge is, for the first 97, 98% of humanity, we didn't have writing. So we've told stories about how things were, how we got here, how to live in right relationship to reality, and we passed those stories on. And as conditions changed, our stories would naturally morph and change based on what reality was revealing over time. The problem with written texts, especially when they get described as sacred or holy, unchangeable, is they freeze in time. So they can't evolve. The only thing that can evolve is our interpretation of the stories. And so people stop paying attention in the religions of the book, for example. Largely, people have stopped paying attention to what God, reality, is revealing through all forms of evidence, let's say in the last, 2,000 years, and looking only to ancient texts. So it's idolatry of the written word. It's not disparaging the written word at all. I mean, I am profoundly indebted to the written word and the wisdom that is gained, and not just our inner, but how we understand reality in all of its manifestations. Ultimately, when science is doing its job, it's expressed in writing, but it helps us understand reality. When religion is doing its job, it helps us relate to reality, and both are necessary, just like the two halves of our brain.
Thank you so much, Michael.